Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode we are recording today. I'm delighted to be joined by Fredman, who is the Executive Director at Misgav, the Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy, and Director for Israel at Abraham Accords Peace Institute. So thank you so much, Mr. Fredman, for taking your time and speaking to us.
It's a pleasure.
So I wanted to start Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington. And this is his second visit since the war began. How does this visit, if I could compare it to his previous trip, pans out? And is it better than the last one? Is it more successful? What has changed in terms of diplomatic engagement between then and now?
Israel has always emphasized the importance of bipartisan support, and President Biden provided very important support, diplomatic support, military support for Israel during the course of the war. So that Prime Minister Netanyahu's meetings with President Biden were very important. But it's clear that the approaches of the two governments are different, like day and night. And whereas Biden's approach was both sticking to the old paradigms, which have largely failed on the diplomatic level or the geopolitical level, and who often, on the one hand supporting Israel, but also engaging in de facto arms embargoes of Israel, which directly undermined Israel's ability to achieve its war goals of eliminating Hamas as the dominant governing and military power in Gaza. President Trump, first of all, is adopting entirely new paradigms, both with regards to the future of Gaza, but also to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, as a negative actor in the region, the need to eliminate Hamas, and on the practical level also has made it clear that the United States will no longer prevent Israel from receiving the crucial defense systems and arms that it needs. So certainly when Netanyahu comes at this time, it's in a whole different ballgame, a whole different frame of reference, and the opportunities for achieving victory over terror and for breaking old paradigms and for shaping a better future for the region are much greater.
And before the press conference started, there was a bilateral meeting between the two leaders. Could you tell a little bit about what were the possible discussions between the two leaders, and was there any significant points of agreement/disagreements on the table?
I don't know what was said inside the room. I understand that Netanyahu focused on the issues that are most urgent and most important to Israel. That certainly includes the future of Gaza, and that includes Iran. Whether or not there are disagreements in the room, I don't know. I do think that we saw different approaches with regards to Iran, which is no less important than Gaza, in the press conference, where both countries are united in the goal of preventing Iran from ever achieving a nuclear weapon. President Trump made it clear that his very strong preference is to avoid the need for military force and to achieve that goal from using economic tools and levers. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu would have wanted or would have preferred, a more explicit military threat to accompany the maximum pressure campaign. But I think both countries agree that the first step should be a maximum pressure campaign and hopefully use that to prevent Iran from a nuclear weapons capability. How quickly you move from that to a military option might be a point of difference, but that we'll only see as time goes on.
And one of the points of discussion that a lot of people were speculating is the second phase of the hostage deal. Is that something on the table as well? Because the negotiation started, and is there something positive on that regards?
it's definitely on the table. Israel is committed, as is the United States, to getting as many of our hostages back as possible. What will happen, the question is this. I think that Hamas is, as the second stage goes on, or the second stage, the third stage, Hamas's demands are going to grow. And it won't be just about releasing terrorists. It'll be about, for example, receiving reconstruction materials. Hamas will demand cement and dual-use electronics and dual-use materials and heavy machinery. It will demand further and further Israeli retreats, making it more and more difficult for Israel to prevent Hamas from training new fighters and from building new weapons. And I think what we'll see is, because Hamas knows that Israel would like to eliminate it as the dominant force in Gaza, we'll see it slowing down and drawing out the process as much as possible. And I think that tragically, in the end, not agreeing to release all of the living hostages, because they will always want to keep a few as an insurance policy. And once that happens, the question is, at what point do you decide that the negotiations aren't working, or Hamas's demands are unacceptable, and then you resort once again to military force? Once that happens, then Trump's vision becomes possible. You weaken Hamas further, you create other options for Gazans, you create mechanisms for them to be able to leave safely. Hamas has been weakened, they're able to leave safely. I think many of them will want to leave if they have a better option for housing, for education, for the future. But there will be a strong debate within Israel and the United States, between Israel and the United States. At what point are the negotiations breaking down, or do we just keep going and keep dragging them out, for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years, for who knows how long, in order to get as many of the hostages out alive as possible? And how far do we go in responding to Hamas's demands and enabling Hamas to rearm for the goal of getting more hostages out?
And I want to come a little bit to the actual press conference that happened. And I wanted to start, of course, with what's the most buzzing news that has been hitting the headlines about the U.S. proposal for Gaza. Now, I'm sure that you have heard as well President Trump's word. And while we have heard his policy or his idea of rehabilitating Gazans, and we have heard that he proposed it before this started, but what he said about U.S. having control of Gaza for a while, is that something came out of nowhere? And from Israel's perspective, how does this proposal align with his long-term security goals?
Whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu, Minister Dermer, or others knew about it ahead of time, I don't know. If so, it was in very, very small circles. I think that none of Israel's commentators, experts, researchers, and analysts knew this was on the table. There was a lot of talk about the need to change the borders with Gaza, the periphery, the northern, the border, the Philadelphia crossing, but not the idea that the United States would take control of Gaza. But there really is no future for Gaza as long as Hamas is in power. And not just as long as Hamas is in power, but unless and until the median age in Gaza is 18. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip 18 years ago. That means that half of the Gaza population grew up in Hamas schools, went to Hamas mosques, watched Hamas media, knows no other reality for Hamas. So in order to create a better future for Gaza, you have to eliminate Hamas, and you have to undergo a process of de-radicalization, or parallel to denazification after World War II, and obviously the reconstruction. Now, that is the President Trump's proposal of voluntarily, not forcing anybody out, but allowing those who voluntarily want to relocate, allowing them to relocate, and then eliminating Hamas and beginning this process of reconstruction, is actually not simple, but the most logical or viable path towards really creating a change in Gaza in the long term. Because otherwise, if your goal is the continuation of more wars and suffering, then fine, keep doing what we've been doing for the last 20 years. But if your goal, and that's what's going to happen. Hamas is already training the next generation of fighters, building new rockets. If things continue this way, we'll be in another war in a year from now, and anything that is rebuilt will be destroyed once again. If your goal is really to create a different future for Gaza, you need to think outside the box. and President Trump very much thought outside the box. Now, what'll happen in the end, I think we've seen a lot of processes being put in place, and there are different potential pathways and forks and outcomes. So we'll see, whether or not that the vision is realized just in the way he presented it yesterday. But I do think that he provided probably for the first time, a viable option, how we create a real better future for Gaza, and not just more of the same, or not just more self-illusions where, for example, we have a technocratic government, but Hamas is the main power on the ground. And then we tell ourselves that Hamas is no longer in power, but in practice, Hamas is in power and is rebuilding its terrorist capabilities.
And it's not been even a month that President Trump swore into the office. So this policy that he adopted, it's kind of very radical from the previous regime, because the previous regime was very reluctant to do anything or get involved in Gaza. So is this, for you, a very strong departure from the earlier administration's policy?
I mean, absolutely. And President Biden was a Zionist, supports Israel, but he was still committed to the old and failed Oslo paradigm, that the solution is the Palestinian Authority is the solution, that if Israel just conceded more land, then there would be peace, that the Palestinian Authority could take over control of Gaza were if it wanted to, and those are all just simply not true. And his history has shown that the Palestinian Authority couldn't take over, could barely exercise control in parts of the Judea and Samaria, parts of the West Bank. There's no possibility that it could take control of Gaza. And again, we could agree to this illusion of, for example, a technocratic government, and then they get all of the reconstruction materials. We tell ourselves stories that it's going primarily to rebuild civilian infrastructure. In practice, it'll allow Hamas to rebuild its terror infrastructure, and will just be once again under terror attacks from Hamas. And I think again, President Biden was supportive of Israel, but he was still stuck in these old and failed paradigms, which haven't brought peace and won't bring peace. And I think President Trump is trying something new and different, and he should be commended for that.
And I wanted to move on from that and bring another question that was asked in the press conference. And that was also a very surprising response that we got, that someone asked about Israel's sovereignty in the Judea-Samaria region, the West Bank. And he answered that he hasn't taken a call, but in the next 3 to 4 weeks, they will take a call on that. And a lot of people speculated that it will change U.S. position on the annexation of West Bank. So is that something on the cards as well?
The annexation of the West Bank is a very broad headline, which could mean a lot of different things. After October 7th, many Israelis realized this before October 7th, but certainly after October 7th, it is clear that giving, for example, the Palestinian Authority, which continues to fund terror and pay salaries to terrorists and to incite terror and to hold up terrorists as national role models, and that is unable to clamp down on terror in the Samaria and the northern West Bank. The idea that Israel should, for example, pull out of the strategic high grounds, the heights overlooking Tel Aviv, overlooking Ben Gurion Airport, Israelis are saying that would be a disaster. We would have rockets on Ben Gurion Airport and white Hamas Toyotas driving to Tel Aviv and carrying out massacres and kidnappings. So it's, I think, clear to Israelis, for example, that in no foreseeable future, who knows what will be in the long run, but in no foreseeable future will Israel not have control, for example, of that area. Similarly with the Jordan Valley, right? We don't know whether or not the Kingdom of Jordan will not fall into the hands of Iran or into the hands of radical Sunni groups. And it's clear that Israel needs to maintain control over the Jordan Valley for its very basic security. Does it pay to apply Israeli employment laws or environmental laws or home ownership laws in Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria that nobody believes are ever going to be evacuated or destroyed? So I do think, I don't think anybody's talking about nobody's talking about something like transferring the Palestinian population out of the West Bank, or nobody's talking about it. Nobody's seriously talking about that. But I do think that there are just like the president recognized the change in reality, for example, in the Golan Heights, there are changes that need to be made, should be made, will be made in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. That could be that you could call that annexation, applying sovereignty, applying Israeli law, new security arrangements, and I do think that those are going to be things that Israel raises with the president, and that I think are critical for Israel's future.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you is, since you have been working on this, the Abraham Accords, and we had a conversation about how Saudi Arabia may come and normalize a relationship with Israel for quite a while now. And Trump mentioned that that is also a possibility. But Saudi Arabia was very quick enough to reject the proposal and say that it's not going to happen until unless a sovereignty of the Palestinian state is recognized. How do you see that, and does it pose a challenge, or is there still room for diplomatic progress between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
I think there's a lot of moving parts with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has its own national goals. There are a number of issues that are very important for it vis-a-vis the United States in the security realm, in the diplomatic realm, in the economic realm. And so the question of Israel-Saudi normalization, I think, relates to what Saudi Arabia wants and can and will receive from the United States, from Israel as well. There's no doubt that the Saudi people, like Arabs and Muslims around the world, are truly, the Saudi leadership understands that the PA is corrupt and ineffective. They know that Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization, but there is true solidarity and support for the Palestinian people and a desire for a better future for the Palestinian people, which many Israelis share as well. What that means in terms of the actual arrangements that are made, are we talking about the establishment of a state, or just about a commitment to negotiations over a state? What does that state look like? Is it a state that's demilitarized, that where Israel continues to be able to ensure its biosecurity needs? I think that Israel, if that Israel and Saudi Arabia and the U.S. can find a common ground that will both allow the Saudi leadership to show that it's working for a better future for the Palestinian people, and that will allow that triangle, U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, to enjoy the mutual benefits of normalization and peace.
With President Trump reinstating his maximum pressure campaign on Iran, including efforts to bring its oil exports to zero, how effective do you think this strategy will be in preventing Iran from further escalating its involvement in the war? Could economic sanctions alone curb Iran's support for terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, or will military deterrence also be necessary?
Iran poses a number of different threats. Obviously, the first one is the nuclear threat, but also their own ballistic missile program and the missiles and drones and other weapons that they supply to other hostile actors like Russia and Ukraine. And of course, their support for terror and their terror proxies like Hezbollah, like Hamas, and their direct involvement in carrying out terror attacks against Israel. And we saw that both in terms of their missile attacks against Israel and terror against Israeli and Jewish targets around the world. Now, Israel has already weakened Iran's terror proxies to a very significant degree, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis as well. Those proxies still exist and they still present a threat, though not the same kind of threat they presented at the outset of the war. Similarly, the threat of ballistic missiles, Israel has shown its ability both to defend against those threats and to take out Iran's missile defense systems, certainly putting very, very strong financial pressure on the Iranian regime, will likely make it much more difficult for them to carry out terror attacks to fund their proxies, because they'll have to make very hard choices about how they use their funds. And once Iran no longer the nuclear option is taken off the table, if and when a good deal is reached, that Iran will also be vulnerable to retaliation for its terror attacks. And I think also there should be retaliation for the terror attacks of its proxies. Meaning, if an Iranian proxy attacks Israel, Israel should respond against Iran, not just against the proxy. But ultimately, because Iran has this radical ideology, its desire to create this Shia crescent, its Iranian hegemony across the Middle East, spread the Islamic Revolution, it is likely always going to be involved in terror and destabilizing behavior and formulating conflicts. And therefore, ultimately, whether in the short term or the medium term, the goal should be to support the Iranian people who are calling for a change in government, respect for their rights, for their liberty, for democracy. And I think that countries like the United States, like Israel, should support those courageous actors inside Iran and outside Iran who are working for real change. Because when that change comes, I think you'll have much greater stability in the Middle East. And I think you'll have Abraham Accords or Cyrus Accords, whatever you want to call it, between Israel and Iran, the Israeli people, the Iranian people, once again.
With increasing concerns over global anti-Semitism and growing calls for governments to take action against Hamas sympathizers, do you think that deporting known Hamas supporters from Western countries could serve as a deterrent to anti-Semitism activities inside the United States? And was that one of the conversations President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu might have in the bilateral meeting?
Israel is very concerned about rising anti-Semitism around the world, its impact on Jewish communities, its impact on public opinion towards Israel and on the safety of Jewish students. But ultimately, I think this is an American challenge. You have people who've received, primarily foreign non-Americans who've received visas to come study in America or to work in America, who are promoting pro-terror, anti-democratic, pro-dictator activities, who are violating the basic rights of Jewish students, who are creating an atmosphere of terror and fear. Some of them are actually carrying out physical attacks. So I expect that the Prime Minister raised it, but I do think this is primarily an American issue where President Trump has said this is not opposed to our values, this is opposed to our interests, this is undermining our intellectual pursuits, our academia. This is, formulating terror and extremism that's unacceptable. And therefore, we're especially in the case, but we're going to do two things. We're going to revoke the visas and remove terror supporters from from the United States. And secondly, we're going to ensure that the rights that are guaranteed to all Americans are guaranteed to Jewish Americans as well.
And the last thing that I wanted to ask you is something that you have written, and I was reading your brief. I wanted to ask you that given the continuous threats that Israel faces, how does the recent U.S. commitments to military aid and regional security cooperation can ensure Israel's long-term stability and capabilities? And what do you expect moving forward the Israel-U.S. relationship to materialize into?
As I wrote, there are tremendous opportunities to take the U.S.-Israel relationship which is already very strong, to take it to new heights. And that's on both on the bilateral level and the multilateral regional level. So on the bilateral level, there is room for very significant upgrades to defense and intelligence cooperation. I suggested that U.S.-Israel intelligence cooperation be raised to the same level as the Five Eyes framework, which includes US, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. I think actually that Israel and the US should move from a model where Israel receives vast amounts of foreign military financing from the United States. We should actually move to a model that's focused more on joint ventures, on cooperation, on joint R&D. That's on the bilateral level. On the multilateral level, as the U.S. looks to ultimately decrease its presence in the Middle East, to pivot towards Asia, to avoid getting entangled in additional wars, the way that can be made to happen, and that we can strengthen regional cooperation, is by creating a new Middle East defense alliance, a new regional security framework, where with American assistance, Israel and its regional peace partners increase their cooperation in air, in space, in satellites, in drones, on ground, in R&D, in joint exercises, in maritime awareness, in many different fields. Again, American involvement, American encouragement, American support will be important, but ultimately this will allow Israel and its regional partners to take responsibility for their own security, for the security of the region, to counter Iran and its proxies, to encounter radical Sunni Islamist groups, terror groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, and others. And that will be good for Israel's security, it will be good for regional security, and it will be good for America's core security interests as well.
Well, that's all the question that I had. So thank you so much for taking your time and speaking to us.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.